She showed up to the interview in a coat that had seen better winters. That was the first thing Quentin Marsh noticed. Not the resume she'd placed neatly on his desk, not the way she'd taken the chair across from him without being invited to sit, which he normally would have found presumptuous, but the coat. Charcoal gray wool, the kind that department stores sold in bulk. One button slightly off-center, the thread beginning to fray. She'd worn it into his office on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and she hadn't apologized for it. He remembered that detail later, the not apologizing. Her name was Celeste Adeyemi. She was 38 years old. She'd applied for a position as a junior administrative coordinator at Marsh & Okafor Consulting, a mid-sized firm in downtown Halifax that handled procurement and supply chain work for several Atlantic Canada municipal governments. The role paid $52,000 a year. It was not a glamorous job. Most people who applied for it were between things, between careers, between cities, between versions of themselves. Quentin had interviewed 11 candidates that week. He remembered none of them. He remembered Celeste. Not because she was impressive in the way he expected. She didn't perform. She didn't lean forward with rehearsed enthusiasm or use phrases like synergistic approach or stakeholder alignment. She answered his questions plainly, sometimes briefly, in a way that he initially mistook for lack of preparation. She said she'd been out of the workforce for a few years. She said she was returning to Halifax after living in Montreal. She said she was good with systems and better with people. She didn't elaborate. He offered her the job 2 days later, mostly because the other candidates had exhausted him and she hadn't. That was his first mistake, not in hiring her, in underestimating what that meant. Quentin Marsh was 44 years old and had built Marsh & Okafor over 16 years with his business partner, Jerome Okafor, who handled client relations while Quentin managed operations. It was a functional partnership. Jerome was charming and personable and knew how to make a room feel smaller in a comfortable way. Quentin was precise and methodical and made rooms feel larger by taking up very little space in them. They complemented each other in ways that neither of them fully acknowledged out loud. The firm had 12 employees. It was solvent. It had a good reputation in the municipal sector. It was not by any stretch struggling, but it had plateaued. For 3 years they'd been circling the same contracts, the same clients, the same modest growth projections. Quentin knew this. He thought about it the way you think about a low-grade headache. Constantly, and without doing anything about it. Celeste started on a Monday. By Thursday she had reorganized the digital filing system for their 4 largest accounts, in a way that saved approximately 3 hours per week in administrative retrieval time. She didn't announce this. She didn't send an email saying I've made some improvements. Quentin discovered it when he went looking for a vendor contract from 2021 and found it in 11 seconds instead of 40 minutes. He stood at his desk for a moment with the document on his screen. Then he went back to his work and said nothing. This was, he realized later, exactly the wrong response, but at the time he told himself she'd simply been thorough. Good administrative coordinators were thorough. That was the job. The details accumulated slowly, the way water seeps rather than floods. There was the afternoon in November when Celeste sat in on a procurement review meeting, a routine internal session, nothing sensitive, and afterward she'd left a single handwritten note on Quentin's desk. No preamble, it said. The Bridgewater contract has a renewal clause that auto-executes in February. Nobody flagged it. Might be worth a call. He checked. She was right. The clause would have committed the firm to a 2-year extension at rates that were no longer competitive. They renegotiated. It saved the firm close to $40,000. He thanked her briefly in the hallway. She nodded and continued walking. Jerome noticed her first, in the way Jerome noticed everything that had a social dimension. He stopped by Quentin's office one afternoon in early December, leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and said, "Your new coordinator, what about her? She's not new, is she?" Quentin looked up. "She started 6 weeks ago." "That's not what I mean." He didn't explain further and Quentin didn't ask, and for 3 weeks they both pretended the conversation hadn't happened. What nobody at the firm knew, what Quentin had not known when he hired her, what he had not thought to research, was that Celeste Adeyemi had spent 7 years as a senior policy analyst for the Nova Scotia Department of Municipal Affairs. Before that she'd completed a master's degree in public administration at Dalhousie. Before that she'd worked as a budget coordinator for the Halifax Regional Municipality during a particularly complicated infrastructure overhaul. She had, in other words, spent nearly 15 years working in the exact sector that Marsh & Okafor served. She had left that world 3 years ago. She had gone to Montreal. She had gone quietly, and she had not talked about why, and when she came back to Halifax, she had applied for a $52,000 administrative job with a fraying button on her coat. And she had answered Quentin's questions plainly without performing, and she had not apologized for any of it. He didn't know any of this in December. He found out in January, and not from her. It started with a client lunch. The firm had been trying for 2 years to secure a contract with Stelton Regional Municipality, a mid-sized county government outside of Truro, that was undertaking a major infrastructure modernization project. It was the kind of contract that would have changed the firm's trajectory. Multi-year, substantial in scope, the sort of thing that generates referrals and opens doors. Jerome had cultivated the relationship with the Stelton CAO, a man named Douglas Whitfield, carefully and patiently. They were close to a proposal stage. The lunch was supposed to be Jerome and Douglas, informal, just to move things along. Jerome got sick, genuinely, suddenly sick, the kind of head cold that makes you sound like you're speaking from the bottom of a lake, and called Quentin the morning of. "You have to go. Don't cancel. Canceling sends the wrong message." Quentin was a capable person in many respects. Lunches were not among them. He sat across from Douglas Whitfield at a restaurant on Barrington Street and felt the conversation going sideways in real time. Too technical, too operational, not enough warmth, not enough of the relationship language that Jerome did effortlessly. Douglas was polite but distracted. Quentin could feel the contract slipping before the entrees arrived, and then Celeste walked into the restaurant. She wasn't there for them. She was meeting someone, a woman, older, who hugged her at the door. They sat 2 tables away. Quentin noticed her first and felt a strange reflex of relief, followed immediately by confusion at the relief. Douglas Whitfield noticed her a moment later. His expression changed. "Celeste," he said, loud enough that she looked over. She saw Douglas and something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition of a thing she'd expected would eventually happen. She excused herself from her own table and came over. Douglas stood. They shook hands, and then he did the thing people do when they can't quite contain themselves. He turned to Quentin and said, "Do you know who this is?" Quentin said he did. She worked for him. Douglas looked between them with an expression Quentin couldn't fully read. "She rewrote the entire procurement framework for our emergency services division back in 2018. Saved the county about $120,000 in the first year. We used it as a model for 3 neighboring municipalities." He paused. "I've been trying to get her back on a project for 2 years. Celeste said evenly, "I've been doing other things." Clearly, Douglas said, looking at Quentin, with an expression that had shifted from polite, but distracted to something considerably more engaged. Celeste returned to her own lunch. Quentin stayed and talked to Douglas for another 90 minutes. By the end, they had a clear path to a proposal. He drove back to the office in a silence that had a particular texture to it. He didn't confront her. That's the wrong word for what happened. He went to her desk the following morning with a coffee he'd made for himself, and at the last moment made a second one, and he put it on the edge of her desk. He sat down in the chair across from her, the same positioning as the interview reversed now, and he said, "Tell me about the Stelton project." She looked at the coffee, then at him. "Which one?" she said. "The emergency services procurement. 2018, she told him. Not defensively, not with the performance of someone finally being recognized. She told him the way she answered questions in the interview, plainly, sometimes briefly, with the cadence of someone who has explained a thing many times and no longer needs to dress it up. The framework, the vendor consolidation, the renegotiated service level agreements, the internal resistance she'd navigated, the result. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Why didn't you tell me any of this when you interviewed?" She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't ask," she said. He had nothing to say to that because it was true. He had looked at the gap in her employment, noted it, filed it as a flag, and moved on. He had seen the fraying coat and made a calculation. Unconscious, seamless, the way bias works when it's built into reflex, and that calculation had been wrong in a direction that embarrassed him. "I asked you why you left Montreal," he said. "You asked me what brought me back to Halifax. Those are different questions." He thought about that for a long time after he left her desk. There is a particular discomfort in discovering that you have been condescending to someone who was, quietly and without complaint, doing work far below their actual level while you took it for granted. It doesn't feel like guilt, exactly. It feels more like vertigo. Like the floor has shifted slightly and you are recalibrating your balance. Quentin was not a man who dealt in grand emotional gestures. He dealt in adjustment. In taking information and reorganizing around it, he reorganized. He went to Jerome first. He told him what he'd learned. Jerome listened with the expression of someone who is not entirely surprised but is relieved to no longer have to pretend otherwise. "I told you she wasn't new," he said. "You said she wasn't new. You didn't tell me what she actually was." "I didn't know what she actually was. I just knew she was something." He paused. "What are you going to do?" Quentin said. He wasn't sure yet. Jerome said, The obvious thing requires a conversation. Then have the conversation." He asked her to lunch. Not at the same restaurant on Barrington Street. Somewhere smaller, a place on Gottingen that did soup and sandwiches and had mismatched chairs and no ambient music. He chose it because it was the kind of place that didn't perform. He ordered and she ordered, and then he said, I'd like to offer you a different role. She was watching him with an attention that didn't feel evaluative exactly, more like she was tracking where the sentence was going and making no assumptions about the destination. What role, she said. We're calling it Director of Strategic Development. It doesn't exist yet. I need to build it around you. He paused. The salary would be substantially different. She said, you don't have to do this because of Douglas Whitfield. I know. Then why? He thought about how to answer honestly without making it about absolution, because it wasn't about absolution, and she deserved more than being handed someone else's moment of reckoning. Because I looked at how you've approached every project in this office for 3 months, and I've been an idiot about it, he said. And because the Stelton proposal that Jerome is currently writing would be better if you were writing it. She was quiet for a moment. I need to know why you left the municipal sector, he said. Not because I'm asking you to justify yourself, because if there's a reason you don't want to go back to that kind of work, I need to understand it before we restructure a role around it. Something in her face shifted. Not the way things shift when someone is deciding how much to reveal. More the way things shift when someone has been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to ask the right question. She told him over soup that went cold. She'd been at the department for 7 years. She'd built a reputation as someone who could walk into broken systems and make them work, which meant she was regularly handed broken systems without commensurate recognition, because the people who assigned the work could tell themselves it wasn't that complicated, and Celeste would handle it. She'd been passed over for a director position twice. Both times the role went to someone with fewer qualifications and more visible confidence, which is not the same thing as competence, but reads the same in a room where nobody is paying close attention. The third time she'd raised it, not loudly, not with ultimatums. She'd documented her contributions, prepared a clear case, requested a meeting with her division head, a man named Gerald Creighton, who was pleasant and well-meaning and had spent 20 years in the public sector without once being asked to examine his assumptions about who looked like leadership. Gerald had listened. He'd nodded. He'd said things like, I hear you, and we value your work enormously, and then he'd said, carefully, I think the challenge is visibility. You do the work so quietly that sometimes people don't realize how much you're contributing. She'd understood immediately what he was saying and what he wasn't saying. The solution he was gesturing toward was for her to perform more, to take up more space, to be louder, more assertive, more visible in the way that the two men who'd gotten the director roles were visible, which was to say, in a way that required she become less herself in order to be seen as more. She had thanked him for his time and gone back to her desk. 3 months later, she handed in her notice and moved to Montreal. She spent 2 years there. She did some consulting work. She lived quietly. She came back to Halifax because her mother was aging and Halifax was home, and because at some point the energy it takes to stay away from a place costs more than the energy it would cost to simply return. She applied for the administrative coordinator role at Marsh & Okafor because she was tired. Not permanently tired. Temporarily. She needed somewhere to land while she figured out whether she had anything left to give the kind of work she used to do. And do you? Quentin asked. She thought about it for a moment. I think I've been doing it anyway, she said. He brought her into the Stelton proposal. He didn't ask Jerome first, he told him, which was slightly different, and Jerome understood the difference. Jerome read the first draft Celeste produced and called Quentin from his car on the way home that evening and said, Where did she come from? Halifax. Quentin said, I mean it seriously, so do I. The proposal went to Douglas Whitfield's team in late February. It was 93 pages. It contained a procurement restructuring framework for Stelton's infrastructure project that drew on comparative models from 4 other maritime municipalities, 2 of which Celeste had worked on directly. Douglas called Quentin the afternoon he received it. The call lasted 4 minutes. At the end of it, Douglas said, I'm going to need to meet with your Director of Strategic Development. Quentin said he'd arrange it. He hung up and walked to Celeste's office. She had an office now, the small one at the end of the hall that had previously been used for storage, and he stood in the doorway and said, Douglas Whitfield wants a meeting. She looked up from her screen. Okay, she said, not surprised, not performing the surprise. Just okay, like she'd been waiting for the floor to catch up to where she was already standing. The meeting with Douglas took place on a Thursday in March. Celeste ran it. Quentin sat beside her and understood, with increasing clarity, that his role in the room was to be present without being the person who spoke most. This was a new experience for him. He found that he didn't mind it. Douglas brought 2 members of his team. By the end of the first hour, they were talking about a timeline for implementation rather than a timeline for a decision. By the end of the second hour, they were talking about a second phase, an adjacent project, separate budget, that Stelton had been unable to get off the ground internally. Celeste walked to the whiteboard without asking permission and drew a framework that mapped the dependencies. It took her 4 minutes. Douglas's team photographed it. Quentin drove back to the office afterward and sat at his desk for a while without doing anything in particular. He thought about the fraying button on the charcoal coat. He thought about the interview, and the questions he'd asked, and the calculation he'd made. The seamless, unconscious one, the kind that happens so quickly it doesn't feel like a calculation at all. He thought about Gerald Creighton telling Celeste that her problem was visibility. There is a version of this story where Celeste's quiet competence is framed as a kind of triumph over people who underestimated her, where Quentin's realization is the point, and Celeste exists primarily as the instrument of his becoming a better person. He was aware of this version. He was aware that it would be convenient for him and would cost her something. Some essential quality of her own story, the part that doesn't belong to anyone else's reckoning. He didn't want to tell it that way. He asked her, one morning in April, what she'd actually wanted. Not what she wanted from the role, not what her goals were for the Stelton project, what she had actually wanted, back when she was at the department, when she was doing the work and being passed over and finally leaving. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was sometimes quiet, not reluctant but precise. To be in a room where the work spoke for itself, she said, and where the people in the room were actually listening. He thought about that. Is this that room? He asked. She considered it with the same seriousness she brought to most things. It's getting there, she said. The Stelton contract was signed in May. It was the largest contract in the firm's history. There was a brief mention in a trade publication that covered Atlantic Canada public sector procurement. The article referenced the firm's innovative framework approach, without specifying where the framework had come from. Quentin read it and felt a familiar irritation. The particular irritation of watching credit dissolve into institutional language. And they wrote to the journalist and made clear who had built the framework. The journalist updated the article. Celeste Adeyemi's name appeared in the third paragraph. She mentioned it only once. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. And then they both went back to work, because there was a second phase proposal due to Douglas Whitfield by the end of the month and they were already behind. There's a thing that happens in organizations, and in relationships, and in the particular quiet of a small office on a winter afternoon, when the balance of understanding between two people shifts. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a resolution or a ceremony. It just arrives, the way February eventually becomes March without anyone making a decision about it. By summer, Celeste had a team of 2. By fall, Jerome was looping her into client development conversations he'd previously handled alone, not because he'd been asked to but because it produced better outcomes, and Jerome was, at his core, practical. The firm took on 2 new clients in the Atlantic Canada municipal sector, both of whom had heard Celeste's name in conversations that Quentin had not been present for. She was building a reputation again, quietly, in the way she built most things. Without performing, without apologizing, without waiting for someone to give her permission. She kept the charcoal coat. He noticed it on a coat rack by her office door one day in November, more than a year after she'd worn it to the interview. The button had been re-sewn, the thread was new. He noticed that too and said nothing about it, because some things don't need to be said. There is no single moment that explains Celeste Adeyemi. That's the thing that gets missed in stories about people who were underestimated and then recognized. The recognition isn't the point. The recognition is just one person finally seeing what was already there. What was already there was 15 years of work done with precision and without performance. A framework that saved a county government $120,000 in its first year. A procurement strategy built on a whiteboard in 4 minutes that 2 professionals photographed because they didn't want to lose it. A question answered plainly, you didn't ask, that a man with more self-awareness than he was previously using, took home and sat with for 3 weeks. What was already there was a woman who left a job not because she was defeated but because she refused to become someone else in order to be seen, who spent 2 years in a city that wasn't home, doing the quiet work of deciding what she still had left to give, who came back in a coat with a fraying button and answered questions without apology and waited, not with bitterness, but with patience, for a room that was actually listening. She's still waiting, in some ways, most people are. But the room got quieter. And Quentin Marsh learned, at 44, that there is a difference between seeing someone and finally looking, and that the distance between those 2 things is sometimes the whole story.